Before and during the American Revolution, there were a number of extremely questionable types of people in North America who were involved with the U.S. government, other than the traitors Benedict Arnold and John Andre, who himself was actually hung for treason. Colonel Timothy Pickering was an Eastern, or Northern, Anglophile who pushed for pro-British policies during his political career. He is most noted for his work as the Secretary of State, 1795 to 1800, under Federalist John Adams, when he pushed his strong Federalist Party attachments to the British causes. These people may be defined in three classifications. 1. Anglo-Saxon Tories who wanted Old England restored to the rule over the Americans under a British flag. 2. Anglo men who wanted to see a separate blue state Northern American New England as its own nation through secession. And 3. Northern blue state liberals who, believing in exactly the same form of treason as the Tories and the Anglo men, wished to rule the libertarian South as a politically conquered and subjected people. The Essex Junto and the Hartford Convention. The Essex Junto was a political faction of radical Massachusetts blue state Federalists such as Theophilus Parsons. They were called Blue Lights because of the northern treason they committed against the United States during the War of 1812, when they warned the British of American blockade runners. Today they are the political party of the northern blue states. This Hartford Convention was a pro-Northern, modern liberal, blue state grief committee which met to discuss their ongoing problems with the War of 1812, as well as their personal problems with the three supposed Southern benefits, namely the 3/5 compromise slave vote in the South, the Louisiana Purchase of Thomas Jefferson's man James Madison, and the Jeffersonian embargo of 1807. Everything that the northern blue states ever complained about had to do with the Southern constitutional power and the South's determination to read the Constitution exactly as written. Like Andre, Alexander Hamilton, John Marshall, and John Jay were also loved by the Loyalists, Tories, and the other New England traitors to the American Revolution. And like John Andre, these New England Northern people actually wanted a British form of government returned to them once again, even if it meant giving up their American victory in the Revolutionary War. At the very least, they wanted what Abraham Lincoln would insist upon in 1860, that short and sweet dance of the old woman, as he called his own particular witch, high protectionist tariffs, internal improvements paid for by the South, a consolidated and centralized general government, and a national supremacy of Washington City over the sovereignty of the several states. The British have a king, and they call this form of government a monarchy. The Russians have no king, nor any czar, any longer, and so they call this form of government the National Socialist Democratic Party, or just simply communism. In the United States, it is known as blue state liberalism. In fact, Karl Marx, the father of Marxist communism, actually wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln after the war and congratulated him on bringing Russian communism to the United States of North America at last. The Jay Treaty, or Alexander Hamilton's Treaty. John Jay was a pawn and a product of Alexander Hamilton's British mercantile design. John Jay did not sign the Declaration of Independence, nor did he attend the Constitutional Convention. He was not important enough, nor committed enough for those two acts, it seems. Yet John Jay became the nation's first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, made so by President George Washington. Jay's treaty, whose terms were primarily designed by Alexander Hamilton, with the behind-the-scenes agitation in Britain from Alexander Hamilton himself, did much to alienate George Washington from the people, in making France upset with Great Britain's now most favored nation status in trade with America. The Jeffersonians were livid over the problems this was now causing the U.S. with France, who had themselves now taken to impressing our seamen from American vessels just as the British were doing, as well as to capturing our vessels at sea. The constitutionalist Jeffersonians in each state complained that close ties with Britain would promote the British Anglomany, which would strengthen the northern blue state liberals and their quest for American empire over the Constitution, promote aristocracy, and undermine libertarian constitutional government everywhere else. The main effect of the treaty was that Britain paid New England's American shipbuilders some $10,345,000 for lost ships, while John Jay, a Northern Yankee abolitionist, quietly removed the section of the treaty which would have paid Southern slaveholders for their lost property during the Revolutionary War. Of course, nothing stopped the British from continuing to steal American sailors at sea, and so most of the treaty was a wasted effort on the part of the United States. Land did not change hands on either side. However, so long as the Northern shipbuilders got their money, and Hamilton and the Federalists were happy, then all had to be seen as good by everyone else. This was repeated later during the Civil War, when England would not help the South, who was being invaded by these same Northern Federalists, now called Yankees, to stop the Northern war crimes and to get the much-needed Southern cotton for England. The notion of implied powers and reading between the lines, as Hamilton suggested, has been used in order to legitimatize the Northern British blue state American left of the period. Adams, Hamilton, and Marshall, all three conspired to make this the case in our government today. As there are three branches of government, so then there needed to be three pro-British Anglo men working the strings behind the scenes. Alexander Hamilton would sign the Constitution as the sole representative from New York. John Jay couldn't be bothered to show, it seemed, and then spend the rest of his life misinterpreting these United States constitutional issues for the clever mischief of the Northern left whenever they would have the control of the legislative branch. President Adams would then infect the executive branch with such as the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then warp Washington's presidential preferences into a completely federalist monarchical dictatorship as much as was humanly possible, including the selection of John Marshall as Chief Justice in lieu of John Jay himself, as well as each of the Federalist midnight judges he chose to basically thwart Jefferson's presidency at every possible turn. And John Marshall himself would do all that he could as Adams's appointee to bring the federal government over top of the states. In saying that the Supreme Court did not have the right to decide Marbury versus Madison, Marshall cleverly implied that the Supreme Court did have the actual right to decide that statement. Thus the Supreme Court now has the so-called power of judicial review, by default. This was the diabolical cleverness of John Marshall. Although somewhat silent through Daniel Shay's rebellion in 1786, probably because the state of Massachusetts was now itself being the overbearing and taxing Federalist power, all on their own, Hamilton can be traced to every disaster faced by the early government until his death on July 12, 1804. His was the whiskey tax which caused the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. Jeffersonian Congressman William Findley of Pennsylvania said that Alexander Hamilton had provoked the Whiskey Rebellion. In 2006, William Hoagland wrote, Hamilton intentionally pursued a course of action that would provoke the, quote, kind of violence that would justify federal military suppression, unquote. According to Hoagland, Hamilton had been working towards this moment since the Newburgh Crisis in 1783, when he had conceived of using military force to crush popular resistance to direct taxation, for the purpose of promoting national unity and enriching the creditor class at the expense of common taxpayers. The whiskey tax was abolished by the Jefferson administration in 1801. It was Hamilton's idea that a perpetual government debt would be a public blessing, because it would ensure that the supporters helped the nation to survive in order to collect on that debt, but never pay it off. Such was the modern blue state liberal logic of Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was the founding father of the Bank of the United States, a corrupt arrangement where Hamilton was interested in combining the interests of wealthy men with those of the government. The BUS, or Bank of the United States, was a disaster, with 72% inflation from 1791 to 1796. The British War of 1812 gave it new life, and it was resurrected in 1817. But this bank immediately caused the Panic of 1819, and would continue generating boom and bust cycles for the next 20 years. John Adams was out of office for good by 1801, and Hamilton was dead by 1804. Yet John Marshall infected the United States Judiciary Branch for the next 35 years, spawning the likes of Justice Joseph Story, whom Marshall himself had turned from the libertarian paths of Thomas Jefferson, as well as providing a sounding board for the likes of Daniel Webster, another Jeffersonian turncoat, and Henry Clay, an outright Federalist. And while Marshall and General Andrew Jackson would gnaw neck veins at various times, they were like the mutual hostility that had been enjoyed between Adams and Hamilton. They were just way too much alike to ever get along, too Federalist and too dictatorially British in their views. James Callender wrote of John Adams, "The reign of Mr. Adams has, hitherto, been one continued tempest of malignant passions. As president, he has never opened his lips nor lifted his pen without threatening and scolding. The grand object of his administration has been to exasperate the rage of contending parties, to calumniate and destroy every man who differs from his opinion. Mr. Adams has laboured, and with melancholy success, to break up the bonds of social affection, and under the ruins of confidence and friendship, to extinguish the only beam of happiness that glimmers through the dark and despicable farce of life." All wars and all political parties are started over money. Not religion, not preserving unions, not slavery. Nothing else but money. For the love of money is the root of all evil. The American Revolution was fought by 13 united colonies, with the common purpose of driving Britain and its hatefully intrusive form of a mercantilist government from North America. Britain was a monarchy, and it ran the 13 colonies as though they were its personal slaves. Beginning around 1650, the British government pursued a policy of mercantilism in international trade. Mercantilism says that a nation must export more than it imports. To achieve this favorable balance of trade, the British passed regulatory laws exclusively benefiting the English economy. Between 1651 and 1673, the English Parliament passed 4 navigation acts meant to ensure the proper mercantilist trade balance. The system was called British mercantilism, and it worked like this. The colonies worked only to serve the needs of England. They paid England a profit for everything they did in buying and selling, and they were only allowed to do business with England and no one else. Anyone else doing business with the colonies had to first go through England and pay them for the privilege of working with England's property, the 13 Royal American colonies. The colonies could not exclusively manufacture goods, nor compete against England in any way. The government had to fight smuggling, which became a favorite American technique in the 18th century, to get around the restrictions on trading with the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. The goal of mercantilism was to run trade surpluses so that gold and silver would pour into London. The government took its share through duties and taxes, with the remainder going to merchants in Britain. The government spent much of its revenue to buy a splendid Royal Navy. England aggressively sought colonies to serve her, and once under British control, regulations were imposed that allowed the colony to only produce raw materials and to only trade with Britain. This led to friction with the inhabitants of these colonies, and mercantilist policies such as the forbidding trade with other empires and the controls over smuggling were a major irritation leading up to the American Revolution. New England, however, grew especially weary of supporting Old England, especially in the American slave trade, and they wanted freedom and independence from England. And so we fought the American Revolutionary War. We fought to have freedom and independence from an oppressive government like the one that Britain had provided for us. Naturally, the last thing any American colonist wanted after the war was a government exactly like the one from which we had just fought to be free. We wanted the states to be completely free, the concept known as states' rights. And every state who joined the Union with the United States of America wanted this states' rights for themselves as well as for every other state. The states formed the Union, and not, as Abraham Lincoln would say, that some non-existent union had formed the states. The northern colonies, however, were all Anglo-Saxon English in their heritage, and many of them were Tories, or actual traitors, during the Revolution. The southern colonies were of Celtic stock, of Irish, Scots, and Welsh descent. It had been this Braveheart-like desire for freedom that had welded all 13 colonies together to fight off the largest navy the world had ever seen. This Celtic lust for freedom and independence was the original United States country, and the Northern Tories knew this. Originally, the 9 northern colonies were all in lockstep with the South in this Celtic attitude. The Declaration of Independence, written by the southern Welsh Celt Thomas Jefferson, was copied from the Scottish Declaration of Independence at Arboath in 1320. The United States Constitution was written from the Magna Carta Libertatum of 1215, that was forced upon King John by his country barons at Runnymede. The North had actually chosen a Southern president in the form of George Washington, and they moved the capital south to a swamp in Virginia, now known as the District of Columbia. They did everything that they could to get the four massive Southern colonies to sign a peace treaty with them, to be one nation, to sign the Compact of Union known as the United States Constitution. The country was formed in 1789, and still the Northern Tory traitors waited to make their move. But they would not wait for very long. They began to show themselves during George Washington's presidency. They called themselves Federalists, and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton were the very first of these Northern Tories to offer elected treason to the Constitution, and to display that actual hateful Northern division among we the people. The Philadelphia businessman Robert Morris had been a defense contractor during the Revolutionary War who had taken millions from the public treasury into contracts to his own businesses and to those of his associates. He was also the leader of the powerful Northern New England Federalist forces. Morris wanted to create the Bank of the United States to be modeled after the Bank of England. No other banks would be permitted to operate in the country. Morris recruited a young Alexander Hamilton to serve more or less as his servant within the Washington administration. Hamilton actually became Washington's first Secretary of the Treasury, despite having absolutely no experience nor reputation at all in the field of money and finance. He had actually been one of Washington's cannoneers during the Revolutionary War. In making his case to President Washington for the constitutionality of a central bank, which had been explicitly rejected at the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton dreamed up the myth of implied powers of the United States Constitution. These were powers that were not actually real, not actually powers that the federal government were given in the Constitution, but could be envisioned or dreamed up or implied by clever lawyers like Hamilton. This, of course, became the ultimate excuse for a corrupted system designed specifically for the total destruction of constitutional limitations on the powers of the modern federal government. Hamilton was indeed the founding father of constitutional ignorance through what we now call judicial activism, or the power from somewhere other than the Constitution for the judiciary or the Supreme Court to decide the job of the presidential veto, that is, to decide the constitutionality of a particular law from the legislature, only without the possibility of a two-thirds override by that same Congress who had passed the law anyway. As Jefferson said, such a practice makes the Supreme Court able to turn the United States Constitution into a thing of wax. Hamilton was the leading advocate of a constitutional convention to amend the nation's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. He fought for 7 years to have such a convention convened, constantly complaining to George Washington that we need a government of more energy. Patrick Henry opposed Hamilton by calmly pointing out that the Articles of Confederation had created a government powerful enough to raise and equip an army that defeated the British Empire, and that seemed sufficient for Patrick Henry. At the convention, which trashed rather than amended the Articles of Confederation, Hamilton laid out his grand plan. A permanent president who would appoint the governors of each state and who would have veto power over all state legislation, and a national government with the president giving essentially the powers of a king. It was all rejected when the convention spurned Hamilton's ideas and adopted a federal system of government instead, under the Constitution, with only a few powers given to the central federal government by the sovereign states, mostly to represent us to foreign countries. Hamilton subsequently denounced this new Constitution as, quote, a frail and worthless fabric. Since Hamilton had failed to get a United States Constitution that would allow the pro-British Tory Federalist traitors their power over the country, he set about using a series of outright lies to pervert the existing document to his favor. He lied that the states were a nation assembled and that, as such, outranked each state in the individual, and as an art form. He said that the states themselves were artificial beings and had not created the Union, but that the Union had created them instead. He came up with resulting powers which would allow the United States to become like Nazi Germany and conquer other countries for monetary profit. He misread the General Welfare Clause to make anything the government had to do to become an empire to be legal. He invented war powers for the federal government, not constitutionally provided. Through Justice Joseph Story, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and Abraham Lincoln, all of them pro-Northern British Tory Federalists themselves, they all agreed with Hamilton on every point and upon every concern. Our government was to be a monarchical dictatorship run by the American left, without so much as a by your leave to the real United States Constitution or the modern-day libertarians for which it stood. And from these Adams-Hamilton Federalists, who renamed themselves Henry Clay Whigs, and then the Northern Radical Republicans under Abraham Lincoln, and finally down to the blue state liberal Democrats of today, this is their long-standing agenda: to put us all once more back into the colonial condition under a tyrant that they call New England, or the modern blue state left. As Gore Vidal said, we are a one-party system with two halves. Thomas Jefferson described these men and the coming of the northern blue state left to power and to unjust dominion in this country as the reign of witches. On Friday, December the 10th, 1819, Thomas Jefferson watched a debate in Congress over the admission of Missouri to the Union. Thomas Jefferson on the Missouri Compromise. This momentous Missouri question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it once the knell of the Union. The Missouri Compromise was only a reprieve, not a final sentence. For as he wrote to Lafayette, the Missouri Compromise and the question of slavery was about ever so much more than just the right to own any Negro slaves in the territories. As Jefferson would put it to Lafayette, "It is not a moral question, but one merely of power. Its object, the abolition of slavery, is to raise a geographic principle for the choice of a president, and the noise will be kept up until that is effected." And so it was. Thomas Jefferson was exactly right. They played upon the sympathies of Southern planter George Washington because they knew that George Washington was, in reality, Anglo-Saxon born and sympathetic to the British way of doing things. Indeed, it had been this ability of Washington's to compromise between the two countries that made him so well loved by everyone. It was also to be the cause of his greatest irritation during his 8 years as president. His 1796 farewell address is a scathing and a blistering indictment against Alexander Hamilton's most demonic invention, the American political party system. In contemplating the causes which may disturb our union, it occurs as a matter of serious concern that any ground should have been furnished for characterizing parties by geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, whence designing men may endeavor to excite a belief that there is a real difference of local interests and views. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. You cannot shield yourselves too much against the jealousies and heartburnings which spring from these misrepresentations. They tend to render alien to each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. All combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party. And according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. However, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state, with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally.
If you do not stop the lives of my soldiers, I promise you, I will return with a detail and I will burn every house on this block down to the ground. Now, for the safety of everybody, go back to your homes.
Do you know how to be
Move these people out of the street now!
Load on the march, gentlemen!
This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in its greatest rankness, and is truly their worst enemy. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism. The habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration, to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres. Avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another. The spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political power by dividing and distributing it into different depositaries and constituting each the guardian of the public weal against invasions by the others. The nation which indulges towards another an habitual hatred is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity, of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its interest. How many opportunities do they afford to tamper with domestic factions, to practice the arts of seduction, to mislead public opinion, to influence or awe the public councils? In offering to you, my countrymen, these counsels of an old and affectionate friend, I dare not hope they will make the strong and lasting impression I could wish, that they will control the usual current of the passions, or prevent our nation from running the course which has hitherto marked the destiny of nations, that they may now and then recur to moderate the fury of party spirit, to warn against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue, to guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism. Adams' own son, John Quincy Adams, yet another Yankee Federalist, would steal the election with a corrupt bargain from one liberal named Henry Clay, who would then become John Quincy Adams's Secretary of State for his role in getting Adams elected president. After 24 excellent years of conservative, libertarian, founding fathers' rule, in the era of good feelings, the left were coming back to the White House once again. Adams, 6, was going to be president. But Thomas Jefferson, instead of supporting Andrew Jackson, had favored a man named William Crawford of Georgia over Jackson or anyone else for the 6th presidency. This William Crawford had been a veteran of both Madison and Monroe's excellent presidential cabinets, and was indeed the best choice to have been found anywhere. Anyone was better than John Quincy Adams and the American left. Unfortunately, Crawford suffered a stroke in 1823 and was taken out of contention for the job. Thomas Jefferson denounced General Andrew Jackson to Daniel Webster in this manner. "I feel very much alarmed at the prospect of seeing General Jackson president. He is one of the most unfit men I know of for such a place. He has had very little respect for laws or constitutions. His passions are terrible." Thomas Jefferson, it seems, knew Andrew Jackson all too well, and could indeed have predicted Jackson's evil force bill against South Carolina, when South Carolina acted in a very Jeffersonian manner by nullifying the Northern Tariff of Abominations. Upon the spirit of the newly hatched American political party system, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, wrote, "The country is so totally given up to the spirit of party that to not follow blindfold the one party or the other party is an unforgivable offense." Federalist Chief Justice John Marshall. The Supreme Court and the United States judiciary were so weak under the United States Constitution that only the executive and the legislative branches were even considered important. The judicial branch had no real powers at all, save from being an appellate court to lower court decisions. And so a Supreme Court judge was basically no threat at all to anyone, until the blue state Federalist liberals came to power, that is. Thomas Jefferson saw his cousin John Marshall as a political threat, and he wished to see him banished to a position of a judge because he thought that this would neutralize John Marshall. In a letter to James Madison, Jefferson said, "I am told that Marshall has expressed half a mind to come to Washington. Hence I conclude that Alexander Hamilton has plied him well with flattery and solicitation, and I think nothing better could be done than to make him a judge, just to keep him out of the way." Federalist Chief Justice John Marshall, his own name and political title being a contradiction in terms as to both title and loyalty to the United States Constitution, claimed that Jefferson had such prejudices against England that it made Jefferson unfit to govern. Spoken like a true modern blue state liberal. This, however, should not be counted as treason on Thomas Jefferson's part, but rather upon the part of Federalist Tory mercantilist Chief Justice John Marshall, for England was actually the enemy of the United States until well past the War of 1812. Thomas Jefferson was firm in his dislike for Marshall. He told Federalist Justice Joseph Story, who himself was an outright disciple of Marshall and Hamilton, and who had actually begun political life as a true patriotic Jeffersonian, that, "When conversing with Chief Justice John Marshall, I never admit anything. So sure as you admit any position to be good, no matter how remote from the conclusion he seeks to establish, you are gone. So great is his sophistry, or the use of fallacious arguments with the intent of deceiving, or what the modern blue state liberal does, which is known as spin-doctoring. You must never give him an affirmative answer, or you will be forced to grant his conclusion. Why, if he were to ask me if it were daylight or not, I'd say, 'Sir, I don't know. I cannot tell.'" Thomas Jefferson also added that Chief Justice John Marshall, the Northern Federalist who had been one of John Adams's evil midnight judges styled appointments, put into place merely to thwart Jefferson's presidency at every opportunity. Adams had wanted John Jay, but John Jay had refused. Still, there was John Marshall, ready-made to channel the long-dead British mercantilist Tory evil of one Alexander Hamilton back into the poor nation once again. Adams had his blasted revenge against Jefferson for beating him in the presidency after all. The nation would suffer under Blue State Federalist John Marshall for 35 years. Marshall had written a 5-volume book describing George Washington as a Federalist, and Jefferson denounced the book as Federalist propaganda. The 5-volume libel represents us as struggling for office, and not at all to prevent our government from being administered into a monarchy, or a Blue State Federalist British mercantilist form of rule. The life of Alexander Hamilton is in the hands of Marshall as the author, who adds the rancor of the fiercest federalism, or Northern Blue State liberalism. Jefferson commented on the biography that Marshall had written about George Washington by saying that he thought Marshall was poisoning the public mind and gaining a passport to posterity. That's you guys. Mr. Adams' papers, too, in his biography, will descend, of course, to his son, John Quincy Adams, whose pen, you know, is pointed, or cutting and sharp, and his Northern Federalist prejudices not in our favor. Thomas Jefferson to John Taylor of Caroline. It is true that we are completely under the saddle of Massachusetts and Connecticut, and that they ride us very hard, cruelly insulting our feelings as well as exhausting our strength and substance. The natural friends, the other 3 eastern New England states, join them from a sort of family pride, and they have the art to divide certain other parts of the Union so as to make use of them to govern the whole. This is not new. It is the old practice of despots to use a part of the people to keep the rest in order. It was the irresistible influence and popularity of General Washington, played off by the cunning of Hamilton, which turned the government over to anti-republican or liberal hands, or turned the Republican, libertarian, members chosen by the people into anti-republicans, liberals. The reign of witches. We are suffering deeply in spirit and incurring the horrors of a war and long oppressions of an enormous public debt. This film, The Reign of Witches, is the first film in the series of films to be called The History of the American Left. It is designed to detail how the horrors of the present-day American political party system keeps this nation divided in two, and how the promises made to the Founding Fathers in Congress assembled so many years ago have been ignored and indeed broken entirely by the one-party system with 2 halves, the invention of Alexander Hamilton and the American left.